However great this period was for the arts, it was still a troubled time. It proved difficult and fatal for the Jacobeans. In order to understand the turmoil, a little understanding of the English Parliament is needed. Back in 1215, a negligent king ruled England. His name was King John. You might have heard of him, the King John from Robin Hood Tales and the Shakespeare play. Well, King John ruled while the rightful King Richard the Lionhearted was out fighting the Crusades. King John was so incompetent in his rule that the barons and landowners rose up against him and they forced him to sign what is known as the Magna Carta. This was in 1215. The Magna Carta is a document that limited the power of the King of England for centuries. It was also the inspiration for the Constitution of the United States that was signed in 1789. Now, King John promised that all the kings of England would never act without first checking with the Parliament. And the Parliament usually consisted of the barons and the landowners. The power of the English kings now was limited. They could no longer do what they wanted without being opposed by the wealthy. Now we're going to look at a period called Puritanism so we can better understand the poets and the poetry they were writing at this time. Queen Elizabeth had succeeded in bringing England into a time of normalcy and peace. Court society created a culture of hierarchy, obedience to the national church, and loyalty to the monarch. So Queen Elizabeth ended the tumultuous times by embracing Protestantism. She was tolerant of Catholics, though. She wanted to keep them from open rebellion. But how tumultuous was it before her reign? Just remember, her father, King Henry VIII, had broken from the Catholic Church to establish the Church of England. He did this so he could divorce Queen Catherine, who was the mother of Queen Mary, and marry Anne Boleyn, who was the mother of the later Queen Elizabeth. After his death, Mary I became the queen. She tried to undo all that her father did by bringing Catholicism back into England. And she became known as Bloody Mary for most of her brutal prosecutions of the Protestants. Now, Elizabeth's ascension in 1588 brought more religious stability. It allowed many of the Protestant exiles to return to England. Now, these exiles would later be known as the Puritans. They're Puritans because they wanted to purify the Church of England, and they also hated all forms and display of wealth. Simplicity was their way of life. They did not really want to break away at first. They just wanted to purify Roman elements of Catholicism from the Church of England. And they also wanted to emphasize the preaching of the word over the Catholic rituals. However, even the Puritans became divided. Some wanted to separate from the church, while others wanted to stay within the church and keep trying to make changes from within. Under increasing brutal persecution, the separatists were forced to emigrate. Many fled to colonies in the Americas to found New England. This included the Mayflower Puritans of 1620, who were among the first English settlers in America. James I died in 1625, having led the country through relative peace. He was succeeded by his son Charles I, who also held his father's beliefs of the divine right to rule. Charles wished to unite all of England, Scotland, and Ireland under one kingdom. The Parliament, however, did not like this. Foreign ideas and influence could hurt their strengthening power base. So between 1628 and 1640, the Puritans that remained in the church decided the only way to make changes was through politics and not the church. Charles I refused to see any new changes in the church. So let's look at the influence of this English Civil War. This can be put into perspective with the chief instigator, Oliver Cromwell. He was a member of Parliament. At a young age, he experienced a religious awakening in his 30s when he was just a farmer. He thought the English Reformation of the church did not go far enough, and he thought more changes needed to be made. He thought all Catholic practices and beliefs needed to be fully removed from the church. Thus, he favored Puritanism. He became a member of Parliament in 1628 when Parliament had very little power, and he just served as an advisor. Parliament was summoned only when the king wanted it to. However, both James I and Charles I summoned it often, since the kingdom had run very low on money. This gave the Parliament a certain amount of leverage of power with the monarchy. However, after Charles I dissolved the Parliament, he imprisoned some of the members, and he ruled without Parliament for the next 11 years. This was called the 11 Years' Tyranny. His overtaxing to pay for his opulent living, his wishing for absolute rule, and his mishandling of internal affairs also made him very unpopular with his subjects. Now, two major questions were being asked because of these actions. One, how far should the English Reformation started by Henry VIII go? And two, how much authority should the monarch have outside of the Parliament? The answer to these questions would soon be answered with much blood. Now, when the Puritans, with the help of the Parliament, rose up against the monarchy, the First English Civil War had started. The Parliamentarians, which were called the Roundheads, fought against the Royalists, who were the Cavaliers. Charles I surrendered to the Scots on May 5th, 1646, and this effectively ended the First English Civil War. For the next 12 years, the Puritans held control of England. After the war, the victors were unsure of what to do with the king. Should they take away his power? Should they kill him? Or should they make him king again under a constitutional monarchy? Before they could answer any of these, the king escaped in 1647. Failure to conclude a political agreement with the king led eventually to the outbreak of the Second English Civil War in 1648. The king once again tried to regain his power by force of arms. Now, Cromwell led the parliamentarian armies to put down this king's rebellion, and they ended up capturing Charles I. And in 1649, Charles I was tried for treason and beheaded. In place of the king, Cromwell became the protectorate. He was to safeguard the government of England. With the death of the Scottish-born Charles I, the Scots, with Charles's son Charles II as their figurehead, rose up again against the English and started the Third Civil War. The English, under the military command of Cromwell, soon defeated the Scots in 1651. In 1657, Cromwell was offered the kingship by Parliament. This presented him with a dilemma, since he had been in favor of ending the monarchy. Cromwell agonized for 6 weeks over the offer. He was attracted to the idea because of the stability it held, but he declined the offer. The Cromwell uprising had been successful by making the monarchy powerless, but it failed to create a stable government to govern in its place. After Cromwell's death, there was no stable leader of the government. His son took over duties as protectorate, but he did not last long. The protectorate was dissolved, and the exiled King Charles II was able to return to England in 1660. By 1662, all Puritan ministers were forced to leave the Church of England. Thus, the two questions asked previously were finally answered. How far should the Reformation go? As far as each group wanted. How much authority should the king have outside of the Parliament? None. After 1660, values changed that affected the literature of the time. The court was no longer unchallenged, nor had the money or influence of old. The Parliament became a strong power to rival the monarchy, and the Church of England was now just one of many religious communities. The ridiculed Puritans had become independent and grew, while the new money of commerce competed with the old money of the gentry. Courtly manners were no longer important. Court writing gave way to the private publisher. Booksellers replaced court patrons as the controllers of public taste. The 17th century was therefore marked by indecision and doubt. Politics had split the kingdom in half. The new science of the day was challenging the religious sensibility of the past. A new way of thinking and seeing the world was growing at this time. Religion and science were seen by many to be incompatible. Others saw science as a new way of viewing classical and religious ideas. With the exception of John Milton, the Puritans did not produce any famous poets. The Puritans were mostly writing sermons and experimenting with the prose form. The poetry that was being written at this time was very different than in Shakespeare's time and before. This was the era of the metaphysical poets.